This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. On today's podcast, my guest is Richard Glick, former chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and currently principal at GQS New Energy Strategies. Rich is going to describe the macro grid initiative to drive interconnection of the nation's segmented transmission regions, which could make electricity delivery more reliable and affordable. Rich was named FERC chair by President Trump in 2017. Before that, he served stints as general counsel to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee Democrats, handled government affairs for major utilities, was senior policy advisor to Energy Secretary Bill Richardson, and was legislative director and chief counsel to legendary Arkansas Senator Dale Bumpers. So, Rich, let's start at the beginning. What is this concept of a macro grid, and what needs could the macro grid initiative meet?
Oh, first of all, thanks for having me. In terms of the macro grid, I think the way I think I've heard it best explained, it's kind of like our highway system in the United States, where we have a bunch of different roads, whether they be state routes or local roads, but they're all connected by a super highway system that the federal government operates. And so this macro grid wouldn't have the federal government operating the transmission system, but the idea is to take high voltage, long distance, HVDC transmission lines under the macrogrid initiative, as I understand it, and try to connect the rest of the country. So it's not only connecting different regions of the country, but also connecting the three interconnects we have in the United States, which is Western Interconnect, Eastern Interconnect, and a big part of Texas, which is ERCOT. And so it would be much more expansive than is currently the case.
Yeah, I've often compared it to a situation where you have some kind of goods that you want to transport west from, let's say, Pennsylvania, but you could only get as far as Chicago because there's no highway that's connecting Chicago to the west, and so you can't get it to Denver. It's silly. It's a why then somebody out west has to use their tools to manufacture that good. In this case, it's electricity, and there's places in the West where if you could go the other way, it's cheaper electricity, right?
Absolutely. And there are some connections between, for instance, the Western Interconnect and the Eastern Interconnect today, but they're very limited, and the amount of power you can move over those lines is very difficult. And the problem is there are some times of the year due to weather diversity, you have extreme weather in one area and maybe not in another, where you have a lot of excess electricity. If you just had the transmission capability to send that power from the area that's not experiencing the weather calamity to the area that is, you'd certainly make for a much more reliable grid, but also a much more economical grid as well.
Right. I mean, I'd like to know more about the costs and benefits. That was going to be the next question I was going to ask you, actually. Costs and benefits, uh, interconnecting the U.S. transmission regions. And I also like to know what the barriers are. Why can't we form that interstate highway system with the transmission? I know that one of the benefits, I think it was while you were FERC chair, was the Uri winter storm Uri in Texas. There was electricity both in the east and the west of Texas that they couldn't get to Texas, and people literally died. They froze to death.
Yes, and that's exactly right. So in Winter Storm Uri, which is a perfect example here, we had a situation where, as you know, it was extremely cold, not only in Texas, but also in large parts of both MISO and SPP. At the same time, the weather was relatively mild in PJM. PJM had a lot of excess generating capacity, and they ended up sending a lot of power to both SPP and MISO because they had a number of transmission facilities that interconnected those regions. And the impact was relatively minor in terms of the grid. So, for instance, there were some very small rolling blackouts, but only for a couple hours at a time. Prices didn't go up that much. It was actually a great example where how transmission can help during the bad weather. Texas being a completely different example because of ERCOT, there was very little interconnectivity between Texas, or at least the ERCOT portion of Texas, and the rest of the country. And as you pointed out, they had long-term blackouts, and people literally froze to death, which is beyond tragic. And so I think this is, the macro grid initiative is a perfect example where one of the major benefits is addressing the extreme weather scenarios that we see around the country. And obviously, we've seen extreme weather grow more intense and more frequent as time goes on, and that's expected to continue.
Yeah.
So certainly the
Before,
reliability and resilience of the grid is one benefit, but I would also say there's a couple other benefits.
oh, well,
Um,
good.
one of which is just obviously we're in the middle of a historic load growth brought out by data centers, but also electrification, manufacturing, and so on. And there is a dramatic need for more infrastructure in general. So we need a lot more generation, but we also need a lot more transmission to connect. And again, the better connectivity between regions and between interconnects will certainly help address some of the issues that we see arise as a result of this dramatic load growth. And then there's always the economics of the situation. If you can bring in cheaper power, uh, either because one area, again, is not experiencing the same weather as another area. There may be different issues with regard to, for instance, if you have a lot of solar power, the sun may be setting in one area, still may be pretty intense in another area. If you're able to wheel power from from those areas to the areas with the sun setting, for instance, you can bring in a lot cheaper power, not only address from a reliability perspective, but also reduce the cost impact that we're expecting to see in terms of load growth and what that might mean in terms of the consumer bills.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk about why the barriers, but I want to go back. I've heard it estimated that the economic benefits of a interconnected national type system would be like $3 in benefits for every dollar that would spend to it would cost to build that. Have you heard estimates of that type?
I've seen those estimates, and yes, I've seen 3 to 1, even larger in some cases, and so those are, and you get to an important point. We're talking about cost of building out this macro grid. It's going to be a lot of money. It's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars probably, but in terms of savings, in terms of reliability benefits, in terms of the benefits to the economy, I think the benefits will far exceed. For Order 1000 and Order 1920, the commission saying you have to have benefits of at least 1.25 to or to every dollar of cost
Mm.
before you're going to build a project. If you're talking about 3 to 1 benefits, that speaks for itself, I think, in terms of choosing and building those projects.
I think there's a basic principle in most successful businesses. You got to spend money to make money. Um, and it may be hard for some listeners to think, well, how could you, if you're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build something, how could you possibly make that back with electricity? It's just a few cents a kilowatt hour. But if you take a few cents of savings for each kilowatt hour and you multiply that by 340 million Americans, that's a lot of money that you're saving.
Absolutely, both in terms of the economics, but also think of it in terms of just reliability. If you're reducing
Right.
blackouts, if you're allowing the growth in the economy either through data centers or whatever other electricity intensive industries such as cryptocurrency, for instance, you're going to make that money back in a very short period of time by just having those industries access to electricity, which allows them to expand and use the electricity they need to conduct business.
Okay, and now I want to move to some other subjects, but before we leave this topic, I want to talk about barriers. You were chair. Why didn't you build this microgrid, Rich? It's your fault.
I'll take responsibility.
But
Um, it-
what are the barriers? What keeps people from doing this?
well, there's a number of barriers, and it's not dissimilar to the barriers that existed for transmission development. It's just on a larger scale. So, for instance, um, siting. Siting has always been a big issue with regard to electric transmission. In the United States, traditionally, the states have siting authority, and to the extent you're building, the longer the, the distance of the line that you're building, you're traversing more states. Each state has to approve construction of the facility that goes through their states. In some cases, states may say, well, I'm not really benefiting that much. My neighboring states are going to benefit more. Why am I going to cite your facility and incur the wrath my constituents who don't necessarily want me to be building these facilities. And so that's always been a barrier. And then with regard to other permitting issues, that are mostly at the federal level, but some at the state level as well. As we know, it just takes a long time to build traditional transmission. It take even longer to permit some of these HVDC long distance high voltage facilities. So siting and permitting has always been a barrier. I think certainly cost allocation, which is a barrier to transmission development in general, becomes even more difficult. The longer the distance of the line, and it's more difficult to figure out who benefits and how those costs should be allocated to those beneficiaries. And it just becomes more controversial the greater the expense of the line. People always want transmission, they just don't always want to pay for it. And
Mm.
that remains a huge barrier. And then I think on the planning side, so we're talking about the three P's that always people always talk about with traditional transmission: planning, permitting, and paying for it, or cost allocation. On planning, we haven't really, and this is something I should take some responsibility for at FERC. I think we spent a lot of time thinking about regional transmission planning, and there isn't a significant amount of interregional transmission planning, in part because there's not a requirement, but in part because it's just more difficult. It's difficult to plan transmission regionally, but the more if you bring in more than one region, it raises a whole series of issues, including the utilities in those regions that might not necessarily want that region to have access to another region's power that might be cheaper. And so it just becomes more complicated to engage in a rational planning process on an interregional basis.
Well, I'm not going to let you take the blame for any kind of a failure of planning because your commission initiated what probably is the most biggest effort to create intelligent planning for transmission in a long time. But I want to move on to some other topics. Um, we're recording this podcast on December 15th, and we heard today that a major bill called the Speed Act is perhaps going to go to the House floor today. There are other efforts that also are going to go to the House floor today. All of these efforts are aimed at streamlining the topics that you just mentioned, Rich, siting and permitting. Will these efforts, do you think, impact the possibility of building out a macro grid? And what kinds of siting and permitting are most important? How can you reform these siting and permitting issues so that the self-interests of utilities, of landowners, don't get in the way of doing what's really good for the whole country?
I think that the House bill that you're referring to, the Speed Act, I think it's well intentioned, and it certainly has some provisions that will help on the margin. So, for instance, streamlining the NEPA process. If you're building a transmission project, and the longer the distance, the more likely it is you're going to traverse BLM land or Forest Service land or some other federal land. The NEPA process has long been an arduous process that not only takes a long time to go through, but also increases the cost of doing business. And so I
Let me,
think the
let me
Speed
just say,
Act,
sorry to interrupt, but the NEPA is National Environmental Policy Act. It was put in place, I think, in the 70s, and it was put in place to protect the environment. But at the time it was put in place, people thought, oh, we'll get a 100 or 150-page report on the environmental impacts. Now those studies go on for years and are 1,000 pages or more. And so that's why people, very rightfully want to reform that act,
right?
right?
Right. I mean, the intent of NEPA, and I think rightly so, was to help the government make better decisions, to allow the government to be better informed about the environmental impacts of their major decisions. But as you point out, over time, it is a process designed to take several months. Now it takes more than several years and often ends up in litigation, which takes an additional several years, and it just delays infrastructure projects. So Speed Act is designed to streamline the NEPA process, and I think that's what it's aimed primarily, and that's a positive. But I think there were a couple provisions that were included in the Senate version of this bill when it was considered during the last Congress. It's known as the Manchin-Barrasso bill, that had, I think, a number of provisions that were directly aimed at improving the environment for transmission development that aren't in the House bill. One of which is essentially to streamline the process to allow the FERC backstop siting approach, or in fact, FERC's backstop siting authority to be used more frequently. So, under the FERC backstop siting system, if a state rejects a project or if a state fails to act within a year, that project then can go to FERC, and FERC can essentially override a state decision not to permit a particular transmission project. If there are certain, they would only apply to certain types of major transmission projects. Um, I think that, as I pointed out earlier, it's becoming more difficult to site transmission, especially longer distance transmission that traverses a number of states. I would argue that provision is even more vital to the macrogrid initiative than it just is to traditional regional transmission that we know of. So that provision, I think, is vital, needs to be included in the bill that when the House bill gets back to the Senate. I'd also argue there were a couple other provisions in Manchin Barrasso that directly focused on interregional transmission planning. And as we talked about earlier, interregional planning of transmission isn't really done on a vigorous basis right now. That bill, the Manchin Barrasso bill, was intended or aimed at improving and essentially, in some cases, requiring a better interregional transmission planning process. And I think it would be a shame if Congress were to pass a permitting reform bill and not include those provisions that were aimed specifically at promoting more transmission development.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.